Let's review some key takeaways from week 12, which focused on Indian removal policies, the so-called Manifest Destiny, and the conquest of the American West by the United States over Indian groups, peoples who had called the Trans-Mississippian region home for several millennia. Under the Indian Removal Act of 1830, President Jackson pushed Congress to force Indians to move west of the Mississippi. Congress established Indian Territory, which is now the state of Oklahoma largely, as a new Indian homeland. The U.S. government created also the Bureau of Indian Affairs to manage interactions with Native American groups. Representative of mainstream anti-Indian sentiment by American whites was John C. Calhoun. In this quote, he said, "One of the greatest evils to which they, Indians, are subject is the incessant pressure of our population." This sneaky argument implies that removing Native Americans from their homelands actually helps them, and it tries to justify a harmful policy. Those of you who know your U.S. history probably recognize Calhoun as an ardent defender of slavery. It probably should not come as a surprise that a pro-slavery politician would also defend Indian removal, both from the perspective of white supremacy, but also as the best way for Southern supporters of slavery to protect it by expanding the areas that might become slave states. The Cherokee Indians were living peacefully in the Appalachian Mountains of Georgia and Tennessee. Many had adopted the culture of whites, had assimilated. They wrote and spoke English. They had also their own written script and their own newspaper. They based their government on the U.S. Constitution, and if any group should have been able to coexist with the United States, with white settlers, it would be the Cherokee, who in many ways were indistinguishable from their white neighbors. The Cherokee sued the government of Georgia for taking their land. The backdrop to this is gold. Gold was discovered. There was a major gold rush in Georgia in the late 1820s. In the case of Worcester versus Georgia, to settle these disputes, this case reached the Supreme Court in 1832. The court ruled that Georgia's actions were illegal and the Cherokee could stay, that they had title to their land. Pictured here is the Reverend Samuel Worcester, a missionary who led the court fight on behalf of the Cherokee. I should note that the Cherokee were probably quite capable of leading their own court fight, except for one fact, and that is that the American government did not consider Native Americans citizens, despite the fact that they lived in states. Immediately following the landmark decision of Worcester versus Georgia by the Supreme Court, Andrew Jackson reportedly said, "Chief Justice Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." Jackson, of course, understood that the Supreme Court cannot actually enforce laws. It can threaten and bluster, but in the end, Jackson had all the soldiers. What had ensued has become known as the Trail of Tears. You can see on this map the various groups that were moved from the southeastern United States to present-day Oklahoma. U.S. troops moved 18,000 Cherokee at gunpoint, following strange, circuitous paths, as much as 800 miles in 1838 and 1839. 25% of the Cherokee died on this journey. Most deaths were the elderly and children. Also part of this phase of Indian removal were groups like the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminole. Let's turn next to the concept of manifest destiny. This is a widely held belief by Americans, at least white Americans in the 19th century. There were several components to Manifest Destiny. The first was that Americans were special, almost like a people chosen by God to rule over large swaths of North America. Secondly, the second component of this, Americans were destined to spread westward. And finally, just like the Borg said in Star Trek, you will be assimilated. Resistance is futile. I don't mean to make light of the plight of Native Americans, but there was no room in the American worldview for Native Americans. The annexation of Texas kicked off the period collectively known as that of Manifest Destiny. Texas was a political time bomb. Annexation would disrupt the balance between free states and slave states. Annexation might anger the Mexicans to the point of warfare, and annexation would vastly increase the number of Native Americans in U.S. territory. James K. Polk made annexation a campaign issue, and sure enough, we had war. From April 1846 to February of 1848, the United States was at war with Mexico. It began with a conflict in a disputed border region. Polk made his case that expansion was necessary and good. Mexico was really unprepared for a major war. They had their own internal conflicts happening at the time and really weren't itching for a fight. And the U.S. made fairly quick work of Mexican military forces. Under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which was signed in February of 1848, Mexican was paid for the land it lost in the land cessions. These lands increased the size of the United States by 25%. And increasingly, the West was viewed by the United States as land that was up for grabs. This did not bode well, of course, for the Native Americans already living on these many millions of acres. Also, Native Americans went from being citizens in the lands formerly held by Mexico to this murky legal state of non-citizenship after this treaty was signed. Native Americans in these territories, which later became states, were not given full U.S. citizenship until the 1930s. The land grab continued with the Oregon Territory. Britain agreed to split the Oregon Territory with the United States, thus avoiding war with Britain, and the British part later became Western Canada. Oregon was officially a territory in 1848. It became a state in 1858, and a computer game in 1971 that I began playing in high school in the very late 1970s. And to this day, there are generations of American children who play this game. But the same pattern emerged. Native Americans in newly acquired territories lost their rights as citizens once the United States became sovereign. This map shows you the incredible amount of territory that was gained by the United States in less than 2 decades. Around this time, gold was discovered in California. Most of you know at least parts of this story, with the 1848 to 55 era being the peak in gold discoveries. The first strike being made by James W. Marshall in what is now Sutter's Mill, California. But this set off a wave of white settlers migrating to California, and really people from all around the world flocked there with the hopes of driving it rich. The effects in California of the gold rush are somewhat less well known today by the average American. California, of course, went from being a territory to a state almost overnight and experienced a massive population boom. Native Americans were quickly outnumbered by vast amounts. They were displaced and lost their lands. They were exploited as laborers, sometimes working in slavery or near slavery conditions. They were at times attacked by vigilantes, with several mass slaughters. We talked about a few of them in the text, numbering in the hundreds of people. And on a macro sense, Native Americans were now hemmed in on the east and the west. Let's turn next to the conquest of the West. It was one thing for the United States to claim Western territories as its own. It was yet another, though, to actually enforce those claims, and it would be many decades before the West would be truly conquered. By 1865, there were nearly 400,000 Native Americans living west of the Mississippi River. There were two main types, widespread throughout the plains in particular, the nomadic and semi-sedentary peoples. Neither group, of course, meshed well with the American ideal of settled agriculturalists, farmers working a plot of land. Most numerous in the West were the Plains Indians, and they were among the peoples also least likely to accept U.S. authority over Native Americans. The reservation system began to emerge in the decade before the Civil War. In 1851, Congress passed the Indian Appropriations Act, which authorized the creation of Indian reservations in modern-day Oklahoma. Later reservations were created by executive order from the president. The purpose of reservations was deceptively simple. It was really to isolate Native Americans, almost like a contagion, from white settlers. Indians were seen at best as nuisances in this time period, and at worst, peoples deserving of extermination. There are many, many wars and conflicts associated with the conquest of the West, but we won't be covering all of them in this review. We'll start with the Dakota War of 1862, which is also known as the 1862 Sioux Uprising. In the 1850s and early 1860s, the Dakota became agitated over their losses of land. They were especially angry over treaty violations, such as the non-payment of promised annuities. We could add to this some food shortages and famine following some crop failures, and by the summer of 1862, tensions were running high in this region. The Americans, of course, were busy fighting the Civil War, and they were woefully behind on payments. And in response, the Dakota took it out on white settlers, slaughtering hundreds of them in a series of loosely coordinated attacks. The U.S. military response in this case was quite swift, as the American government could quickly divert troops, also troops who were already battle-tested. In a military tribunal that was convened, 38 Dakota were executed for these crimes, or alleged crimes. They would say it was a war, and these were casualties. Although I should note that Lincoln commuted 260 sentences of Dakota accused of atrocities. One of the most horrific episodes in the conquest of the West was the 1864 Sand Creek Massacre, which was carried out by Colorado Territory militia. And this was particularly horrendous because these were American soldiers, although Colorado militia, who slaughtered hundreds of innocent women and children. And they attacked the Cheyenne and the Arapaho while they were convening for a peace mission. So especially duplicitous on the part of the United States, as at least as seen by Native Americans after this particular massacre. Red Cloud's War was fought between 1866 and 68 between the Lakota, the Northern Cheyenne, and the Northern Arapaho on one side versus the United States. The Powder River country, as you can see on this map, is the Powder River Basin area of the Great Plains in northeastern Wyoming and southeastern Montana. The origins of the war are a tale that's been told over and over again: encroachment by white settlers on native lands, and can you guess? Gold and silver mining in the Powder River Basin. This war, though, should be considered a short-term victory for Native American forces. It consisted primarily of small-scale Indian attacks on the soldiers and civilians at the forts in the Powder River country, gradually wearing down the soldiers in these outposts and forcing the Treaty of Fort Laramie to bring an end to the conflict, at least a temporary end, but it would be a short-lived victory for Native Americans. In the Red River War, U.S. forces faced off against the Comanche, the Kiowa, the Southern Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes from the Southern Plains. The U.S. goal was to forcibly relocate them to reservations in Indian Territory. The United States was angry with raiding by the Comanche, particularly the exploits of famed war leader Quanah Parker. U.S. military decided that all Indians who did not settle on the reservation by 1874 would be considered hostile. And the war began when Comanche bands refused to resettle. This led to the defeat of roaming bands of Native Americans in the Texas Panhandle, or perhaps a better term would be nomadic and semi-sedentary peoples. The last Comanche bands who moved to the reservation at Fort Sill, what is now present-day Oklahoma. One of the highlights of the conquest of the West was the Great Sioux War of 1876, also known as the Black Hills War. Background, once again, you can almost fill in the blank with the same word, the same four-letter word, which is gold. The discovery of gold in the Black Hills was the #1 reason for war. The U.S. insisted on forcing a treaty with the Sioux, but this was sacred land to the Sioux, and they were willing to fight and even die over land that was held sacred by them. This map shows you the Great Sioux Reservation and the lands that the Sioux were guaranteed under existing treaties at this time. The Great Sioux War is most famous for the Battle of the Little Bighorn, which represents a river in the region. June 25th and 26th of 1876, it took place. Some of you know the story, but Custer made numerous mistakes. He underestimated the size of the enemy. He had his troops out of position despite some of the intelligence that was coming back. But mainly Custer was arrogant and did not listen very well to subordinates and superiors, believing he had a superior intellect and military savoir-faire. Custer and most of the U.S. cavalry in this battle were killed. It was a moment of triumph for Native Americans when word got around, but also it was a moment where the United States doubled down on its efforts to defeat any Native Americans who dared resist the westward expansion of the country. The Nez Perce were a tribe in the Pacific Northwest, and they had an 1855 treaty with the United States outlining their lands and delineating territory that was theirs, but this was ignored, and white settlers began moving into their territory, followed by U.S. troops to protect them. The outnumbered Nez Perce battled across 1,000 miles, pursued by the U.S. Army. They were finally surrendered and forced to return from Canada, or their goal to reach Canada and move to Oklahoma. This is the region, the historic region of the Nez Perce, which is in green on this map. The orange you can see on here is the reservation today. That reservation was created much later than this time period, though. Finally, let's talk briefly about the slaughter of the buffalo. The peak years being 1868 to 1881. The animal was nearly wiped out as a species. In part, this occurred as a result of increased railroad lines, as the railroads paid hunters to exterminate buffalo that were prone to disrupt rail travel, just shooting them, in fact, shooting them from trains in some cases. However, in part, this was an orchestrated attempt by the American government to deprive Plains Indians of a vital resource, a vital part of their economies. This disrupted the lifeways of Plains Indians who depended on the buffalo for many needs, not the least of which were food, clothing, and shelter. It is impossible to estimate the deleterious demographic effects on Native Americans of the mass slaughter of buffalo, but certainly we can say this contributed to malnutrition and health issues and decreases in longevity for Indians. Anecdotally, there are numerous accounts of Native Americans dying of malnutrition or starvation in this time period. Native Americans in the longer term were then forced to be reliant on whatever the federal government decided to spend on aid, which typically was paltry, insufficient, and irregular in delivery. In most cases, the U.S. government also decided to simply stop promised treaty payments, adding to the despair and poverty of Native Americans. Um, the excuse in most cases was that these were the equivalent of what today we would call enemy combatants, and thus any treaties that had been signed with these groups were now null and void because um, either rightly or wrongly, some members of these groups did something at some point to U.S. military that could be interpreted as acts of war. At any rate, this draws to a close our review of content for week 12 in 3190. Have a great weekend.